Hey everybody, it's 11, so we will get started. I'm sure we'll have a few more people coming in, but that's okay. I have posted the order of presenters here in the chat and also the evaluation form so that anybody who wants to fill out an evaluation for the presenters can do so. People who are in the class are filling out evaluations for each other, but anybody else is absolutely welcome and encouraged to leave some feedback for the presenters. Each presenter is going to have 25 minutes for their presentation and then 5 minutes for questions. I will set a timer and let you know in a private chat when you have 5 minutes left. So when you're sharing your screen, you might want to have it so that you can still see the chat window off to the side so that you can see that message come in. Also, when the questions start coming in, you want to be able to see those questions. The recording doesn't capture the chat window, so if you can, when the questions come in, if you can read the question first and then answer, that would be great. Each person is just going to share their screen when it's their turn and then stop sharing when they're done. And thank you everybody for attending today. So we will start with Eric. And Eric, if you want to start sharing your screen, you can do that now.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, that happened last time. Let me do this here. Doug had to enable it, and now I guess I need to enable it. So give me a second. Okay. Okay, see if you can share now. I think I just changed.
All right, let's see. Oh, yep, I did it.
Great. Sorry about that.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. So go ahead and start when you're ready.
All right, so my name is Eric Ford, and this is my capstone proposal for Geography 496A in the summer of 2020. The topic I chose is identifying landlocked public land, which is public land that is not accessible to the public for a variety of reasons. The examples and source data I will show today are all from my home state of Nevada, but the same analysis principles and identification algorithm could be applied to any state with a comprehensive land ownership data set. So I chose this project because I spend a lot of time recreating on public land in Nevada. And as a GIS nerd, I have spent a lot of time looking at land ownership, both at work and when planning my next adventure. Thankfully, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I've tried to access a piece of public land, but just couldn't get there without trespassing onto private land. Sometimes, like in this background picture, it is possible to figure out a way to access the land, but in this case, walking around a sliver of private land turns what could have been a quarter-mile stroll into a 2-mile hike. And if you look closely, you can even see my brown and white dog enjoying this public land adventure as much as I am. Aside from my dogs, I know I'm not the only one who has noticed public land access issues, because in the most recent Nevada legislature, a bill was introduced that would make it illegal to block access to public land, which happens from time to time. In these cases, most often, it's a landowner that's trying to fence and block access to land that doesn't belong to them. But this is another public land access issue that people are becoming aware of. So here's a kind of overview of what I'm going to talk about. First going to be the background, and we'll talk about the history of public land and why the history of public land really feeds into the issues that we're seeing today. And then we'll talk about what public land is and what it means to people, and then also why landlocked public land is an important piece of the puzzle. Then we'll talk about the objective, which is to identify and map all these landlocked parcels that are not allowing access to the public. Then we'll talk about the method, and that's going to include the means of determining whether parcels are landlocked or not. And then the method, which dives deeper into the algorithm I plan to develop, and the approach I'm going to do. And then we'll talk about the data sources, where they're coming from, and where, how I'm getting them. They're all public data and they're all free. So that's what I'm going to use there. And then the constraints, there's definitely obviously some issues that are going to come up that will make these results less than ideal, but at least they're quantifiable, and I'll talk about those. And then I'll talk about the products I'm going to produce, which are the algorithm, some test data, and then a map that people can use to identify public parcels. So first, I'm going to get into what exactly is landlocked public land. And landlocked public land is land that is managed by a local, state, or federal agency for the public to use, but is not accessible to the public. There are several scenarios where this occurs. Most commonly, it is land that is surrounded by private land or is only touching adjacent public land at a single point. And so here's a couple of examples from the Nevada land ownership data set. And the one on the left is a Bureau of Land Management parcel. BLM in this case is Bureau of Land Management, that is totally surrounded by private land. So this is a common scenario, and the only way for the general public to access this parcel without trespassing onto the adjacent private land is to actually just charter a helicopter and fly in. There's no other way to get there. And so the example on the right is also very common and is still considered landlocked public land, even though the public parcel is touching another public parcel. Again, a chartered helicopter would be required to access this parcel, even though it could be accessed by taking a single step from the adjacent public land. So I picture it like a game of checkers, where the black squares represent public land and the white squares represent private land. In this case, by sliding a checker between black squares, the checker momentarily touches the adjacent white squares. So legally, this checker is trespassing, even though it is only briefly passing over the white square. The official name for this scenario is called corner crossing and is considered illegal or not strictly defined as legal in most states. And this issue is becoming a big problem, especially where the land boundaries aren't fenced and public landowners are relying on consumer grade GPS units or smartphones to verify their location. And there's definitely the potential for these users to be trespassing because the location returned by the device is not accurate enough to ensure they are on public land. Another kind of interesting piece of information is that this land ownership, these examples are pretty blocky and square and kind of look like they're a raster, but the source data is a vector, and these are all vector based lines. So there's definitely some algorithms out there that are talking about habitat connectivity that could be probably adapted to this kind of adjacency analysis. But I think that I'm going to keep it as a vector analysis, so because I don't want to lose any resolution in the data set. So understanding the history of public land is a big piece of why the issues we're seeing today are happening. So this all started in Nevada in 1846 at the end of the Mexican-American War, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. And part of this treaty was transferring all the unclaimed land from the Mexican government to the federal government of the United States. So this is basically saying any land that wasn't already claimed is now owned and managed by the federal government. And then later on in 1864, when Nevada became a state, the state constitution states that the state of Nevada won't claim any public land that wasn't already claimed. So basically at this point, any unclaimed land that was not claimed in 1846 is still managed by the federal government today. And you can imagine the mapping discrepancies. There's some holes, there's some overlaps, there's some weird stuff going on just because of the state of the technology at the time wasn't really set up to map large areas accurately. And then the next major change in land ownership was in the 1870s, when the railroads were pushing across the West to get to the Pacific Ocean. And as an incentive to the railroad companies to spend all this time and money building the railroad tracks, the federal government granted access and ownership to the railroad within 20 miles of the railroad tracks. So this every other section turned the whole 20-mile swath or railroad into basically a checkerboard where you have private ownership from the railroad and then adjacent public ownership that was already there. And then since then, obviously, there has been changes in ownership, but they've all been based on land swaps where a private owner wants to develop a piece of public land that's close to town. So they trade out and the private owner gives the government a piece of public land that's maybe outside of town. So the development kind of stays in a core. So after all that, the public land still makes up a majority of the land area in some Western states. Nevada is one of the highest rates, and it's almost 77% public land. And this land is all accessible and usable by anybody whenever they want to, basically. So this list is definitely not comprehensive, but the main idea is that pretty much all recreation can be done on this land with hiking, camping, fishing, hunting, ATV riding, all without needing for permission. However, some consumptive activities like mining and grazing do require additional permitting, but those are still common and widespread uses all over the West. And it is not uncommon to have hunters, OHV riders, fishermen, and hikers all sharing a trailhead and accessing the same public land on the same day. So I just told you that there's plenty of public land in Nevada and all over the West. So why is it a big deal if a little bit is landlocked? As part of my research, I have seen estimates that approximately 2 million acres of public land in Nevada and approximately 15 million acres across the West is not publicly accessible. In Nevada, those 2 million acres represent about 2% of the public land area. So even though landlocked public land is a small percentage, the total area we're still talking about is over 2 million acres. So it's a pretty big chunk of land that just is not accessible. The main reason that landlocked public land is important is that every landlocked acre represents reduced opportunities for public recreation and enjoyment of the land that is owned by everybody. And it also means that the accessible public land is going to be more crowded. Second, landlocked public land is not accessible for management either, so fuel loads cannot be managed and wildlife improvements are not possible. And both of these situations can lead to long-term problems. Most importantly, it would be wildfires. And then these landlocked parcels basically become an extension of the adjacent private land, but can only be enjoyed by a few people, which is definitely not the purpose of public land. I will say there are several types of access programs that are intended to provide access and incentives for private landowners to open up their land and allow access to adjacent public land, but they're not common in Nevada and will not be considered as part of this analysis. So I want to mention that I'm definitely not the first one to tackle this issue, and there are other studies out there. And there's one mentioned here is a good overview of the public land, and the numbers I'm using to estimate land ownership above are also from this study, but they don't share any detailed methodology. So it makes it hard to recreate any of the results, and they don't share a detailed map, they just share the final numbers. And so I hope to share my methodology so that the results can be replicated and potentially replicated over time to see if there's any changes in landlocked public land, especially in areas close to urban centers. And then I also will, at the end of this, publish a map with my results so people can see details of each landlocked public parcel. The objective of this project is to leverage existing land ownership data to identify landlocked public parcels. To accomplish this, I will develop and share a tool to automate the identification process. And finally, I will provide the results in an interactive map form so interested public landowners can zoom in on an area and determine if there are any landlocked public parcels in their favorite area. So to map every landlocked public parcel, I will definitely have to automate the process because there are approximately 75,000 land features in the Nevada dataset alone. Based on the previous examples, it is pretty easy to identify a landlocked public parcel visually. but trying to pick all the landlocked parcels out of 75,000 would be time consuming and error prone. The obvious solution is to automate the identification process, but trying to automate it will pose some challenges because there are so many variations in the spatial relationship between parcels. My first thought was that the analysis portion would be easy and I could just perform an ArcMap near analysis and identify public parcels that are not touching other public parcels. It didn't take long to figure out that the near analysis is not sufficient to determine if a parcel is landlocked because of the corner crossing issue I talked about. In this case, just because a public parcel touches another public parcel, that doesn't mean that it's accessible. After doing some research, I couldn't find any existing automated solutions or out-of-the-box tools that I could adapt for this project using vector data. Thinking about the geometric relationship led me to the solution I proposed for this study, which is to compare the perimeter of every public parcel to the length of all coincident edges for all adjacent parcels. If the sum of the length of coincident private edges is equal to the perimeter of the subject parcel, then it is landlocked. I think the only way to adequately explain this process is with a few diagrams, which are coming up on the next slides. So the first step is definitely to clean the parcel base and remove any duplicates or other slivers or problem polygons. But the first real step is to run the ArcMap geoprocessing tool called Polygon Neighbors. This tool does a lot of the dirty work in terms of defining the spatial relationships between parcels. The result is a table that has a record for every polygon and a record for every polygon that polygon touches. So as you can see in this example, parcel 4557 is touching 3 adjacent parcels, which you can see in the image as well as on the bottom table. And then we also know that this parcel has 3 neighboring parcels from the table, and 2 of them are Bureau of Land Management parcels, and 1 is private. So here the subject parcel is touching 3 other parcels, and the length of the coincident public parcels is 0, as you can see in the length column on the bottom table. And then you can also see that the length of the private is exactly equal to the length of the perimeter of the subject parcel. So we can therefore conclude that this parcel is landlocked based on this table and by visual inspection. So how to do this 75,000 more times? We'll have to build an algorithm, and I plan to use Python to do the algorithm. The Python code will loop through each public parcel in the entire data set and make a dictionary of the perimeter of each public parcel. The dictionary keys will be the unique identifier for the parcel, and the value will be the perimeter. Then the script will use the dictionary to compare the perimeter values for each record to the sum of the private lengths for each polygon neighbor in the polygon neighbors table. And if the length of the perimeter is equal to the length of the private coincident edges, the parcel is considered landlocked and will be inserted into the new feature class of landlocked parcels. If this is still a bit hypothetical, here are a couple of examples that should help. So the example on the left is obviously not landlocked because there's an adjacent public parcel right there in the lower right-hand corner. But to step through the math, the subject parcel perimeter is 400 feet, and the coincident edges are 20 feet of public and 380 feet of private. So the coincident private length is less than the subject public parcel perimeter, and therefore this subject parcel is not landlocked. An example on the right, the subject parcel perimeter is still 400 feet, and the adjacent coincident edges are only private, and there's 400 feet. So since they're equal, the subject parcel is landlocked. So here's a little bit about the data sources I have found. The ownership data is available from the Bureau of Land Management data portal for free and is available for more states than just for Nevada. The data set has been dissolved using the private ownership type, so no individual private ownership data is available, but the public ownership is still intact. So the data has attributes for BLM, Forest Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, etc., shown in the attribute table, and this is important because some ownership types, like military ownership, are definitely going to be inaccessible, like picture Area 51. If anything is getting surrounded by military, we're going to consider it landlocked still. And then the private ownership is simply called out as private in the attributes. There's no actual individual owners, and adjacent private parcels are aggregated into a single parcel. But that's fine because this analysis just is going to consider whether or not it's surrounded by private, so we don't really care about specific ownership, and we don't care about the parcel count that's surrounding these parcels. This data appears to be clean, and there's no slivers or overlaps, but I did find a few duplicate parcels that will be removed as part of the automated process. And it looks like every single record has all attributes complete, so this is what we'll be using for land ownership. The other data set I'm going to use is road data, which is available for free from the Nevada Department of Transportation. And it shows all the state managed roads in the whole state. The assumption here is that even if a parcel shows up as landlocked, based on adjacent ownership, it may have a public road or road that still allows access through the adjacent private land. And the only issue identified with this road data is that it is definitely not a comprehensive data set that includes all public roads, especially local dirt roads. A quick visual inspection reveals missing dirt roads, but the data set represents the best available data, so it will be used in this analysis. As part of my research, I have identified these issues that will affect the final results of the analysis. First is the issue of easements. Easements have the potential to allow access across private parcels that won't be captured in this analysis. This is because mapping and legally certifying easements is a science unto itself. The company I work for has licensed land surveyors that spend a majority of their time gathering historic parcel records and carefully mapping easements, some dating back over 100 years. Given the difficulty and subsequent liability of mapping easements on a single parcel, it is not surprising that there is not a comprehensive statewide easement database, although it sure would be nice in this case. Like easements, historic access patterns can cause parcels to appear landlocked when they are actually accessible via an unposted road or boundary. For example, historic access can be where an old dirt road crosses private land and the landowner hasn't put up a gate or posted it with no trespassing signs. Based on experience, this is fairly common in rural areas, but since access can be revoked at any time, even if it is identified as public land somehow, it is safe to assume that the parcel is landlocked, given that the owner could change his mind at any time. Finally, I already touched on corner crossing, but the issue has become more publicized, and there are several states that have had bills introduced that would define corner crossing and determine whether it is legal or not. From my research, corner crossing is a state issue, so different states could have different and potentially variable corner crossing rules. Based on this variability, all parcels that would require corner crossing to access are assumed to be landlocked until proven otherwise. At the conclusion of this analysis, I expect to share 3 final products: a functioning Python script that automates the identification process, a test data set that includes all possible variations in the public-private land relationship, and an interactive map that will allow users to dig into areas of interest and learn more. The Python script will be set up to work with data from any state that has a private public land ownership database. In order to accurately test and validate the results of the algorithm, I will develop a test data set that has all possible variations of public-private ownership relationships. This will allow future analysis to have access to a fast and easy validation process without having to run the tool on the entire state and find out hours later that something failed and you just need to start over. I think this would be a real helpful piece for future analysis. Finally, the method for showing results is very important. I can picture shrinking the entire state of Nevada onto a letter-sized map and basically having nothing to show at all because the resolution isn't high enough to show any of the landlocked public parcels or any of the other roads or anything like that. I can also picture trying to set up a grid of results from a PDF and share a whole bunch of PDFs with overlapping edges, and that seems like a lot of work, and it seems like it would be hard to share. So my final product will be a web map that includes the parcels and roads used for the analysis, as well as landlocked public parcels, so that users can zoom in and view individual parcels for further inspection. I'm picturing a pretty basic web map, but there may be an opportunity to use some of the JavaScript I learned to make it a little bit better than the standard out-of-the-box tools. With that, that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them now.
Great. Nice job, Eric. Anybody who has questions, you can type those into the chat. There you have one already. And Eric, just to remind you if you can read the question out loud before answering.
Let's see if I can figure out how to look at these questions.
If you take your screen out of full screen mode, you should be able to pop that chat window out. Like if you hover over.
Okay. Okay, I got a couple here. So from Thomas Osen, are you planning on adding Forest Service land and state lands? Yeah, definitely. BLM is the largest owner in Nevada by far, so I'm focusing on those, but we'll definitely include all public land, including Forest Service and state. The data set also includes county and city ownership as well, so I'll be able to identify all those types of ownership surrounding public land. And then the next question is, I assume there can be cases where 2 or more public parcels are connected, not just corner crossing, but taken together are still completely surrounded by private land. Shouldn't these be considered landlocked as well? It sounded like this couldn't be captured in your perimeter-based approach. That is true, so we'd have to figure out a way to determine as an aggregate, so I think I'll have to run the analysis again on a dissolved version of this. So we're basically taking the individual parcels out of it and only considering parcels that are touching. So if we dissolve using the standard Esri tools, we would be able to account for this variable. But that's a very good point. I like that. Okay, so from Daniel, next question is, how will you compile or identify the outlier exceptions, types of exceptions, not the parcels? I haven't really thought about the outlier exceptions. I'm not quite sure what is meant by the outlier exceptions. I'm not sure if it's outlier exceptions. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Oh, okay. Like I described, state land, military reservations, and dirt trail. I think I'm gonna have to have multiple categories. So we'll have landlocked, and we'll have landlocked by military, state land, and then potentially another layer or attribute that quantifies whether or not it's accessible by a dirt road. So I think it's a simple solution is there's going to be multiple categories for these different types of situations that occur.
I have a quick question since we have another couple minutes, but feel free, anybody else, if you have any more questions. But Eric, I know you said there's no inventory or overall sense of easements, but is there any sense of what percentage of the landlocked land is accessible via easements, or no idea whatsoever?
I don't have a very good idea of that. I know some of the mapping that I've helped out with in sort of parcels that are close to the urban areas. A lot of the parcels that are still full sections have access easements along the edges, but these are generally not public access easements. They're for people that own the parcels kind of that are next along the line from these parcels. So so those are very common, but I don't think those would be considered actually public access easements. But I think there's probably some that do. It's just really hard to quantify without doing the actual mapping.
And I don't suppose there's any kind of incentive for landowners to create easements for public access either, I would imagine.
No, that's most private owners are trying to do the opposite.
Yeah.
All right, so another question is, are you planning on using this to help local public land proponent organizations to help gain access or change laws? Yeah, I think that would be a really great result of this. Hopefully this will help get the ball rolling on that, so we maybe have a little bit better access in the future. Because it's, like I said, it's really hard right now because there's no mapping available that shows individual parcels and their status. So hopefully this will help that.
Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions. Really, really interesting project. Obviously, lots of interest based on the questions, and I look forward to hearing how this plays out.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, nice job. Okay, so Eric, if you want to stop sharing, and Alex Scheffler is going to present next. And Alex, you can start sharing and begin when you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I am going to hit the present button. It's hard to do this because I have the chat window open. Oh, the logistics here. Crazy. Okay. Alrighty. Thank you all for attending. Hi. I hear someone. I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for attending my presentation here, and I look forward to seeing everyone's presentations moving forward here. I'm going to be talking about the creation and evaluation of a collaborative web mapping platform. My name is Alex, and I am currently the geospatial analyst for the Venango County Planning Commission here in northwestern Pennsylvania. I was also recently a quality associate for Allegheny Inspections. Just really quick, the outline for my presentation. First, I want to talk about the vision that I have for my project. Then I'm going to talk about some of the background and research that I needed to do for it. Then I'm going to discuss the project goals, the prototype specification, specifically what I'm going to do, what the outcomes will be for my project, and then finally discuss the timeline that I expect to complete the project in. So I think we're all pretty aware that web mapping is traditionally used as a presentation tool, a way to show where we have been. For example, this is a publicly accessible web map showing the condition of pavement for the city of Marina, Arizona. It is efficient, simple, and communicates all the necessary information effectively. However, I would like to propose a contemporary vision for further development. I believe web maps could also be used as a collaborative tool, which would allow specific functionality for planning where to go next. These collaboration elements might involve assigning default roles and special functionality to a set of users who then could exchange communications, control documentation, and assign features to to-do lists. In order to achieve this functionality, I would need to develop a platform that harnesses these abilities. So before I talk more about that, I want to discuss where this vision came from. So the source of my project inspiration came from the time that I've spent at Allegheny Inspections. Allegheny Inspections is a company which provides field inspection services to insurance underwriters with the goal of mitigating risk by identifying hazards and reducing the likelihood of loss. So the basic business model begins when the insurance underwriter or the client orders an inspection, and then Allegheny assigns that case to an inspector, and then the inspector goes out, collects information about the buildings on the property, any hazardous exposures, and liability concerns. Finally, the information is returned, processed by a quality associate, and then sent back to the client for review, so they can make decisions about maybe the premiums that the insured has on the property, and also make recommendations to remove any of those hazards that might have been present. Since Allegheny's current mapping resource is using a depreciating platform, which is Microsoft Silverlight, I believe the development of an open source platform would lend itself well to the widespread distribution and financial feasibility of adopting new mapping tools. The development of an open source platform would lend itself well. An ideal collaborative mapping platform created for Allegheny inspections would be able to highlight the best locations for implementing targeted recruitment strategies. It would also offer the ability to assign cases directly to inspectors based on their covered territory and overall cost. It would be able to distribute those assignments to an inspector via their Q map. So specifically, a manager would be able to look at the map and see where the closest inspector is to a specific case and then directly assign that to the inspector. You would also be able to view a property report, which calculates the distance to nearest fire departments and water bodies, and it could also aggregate major property values, including things like year built, square footage, property value, things like that. Finally, it would also offer visual context for general consumption. For example, if a quality associate needs to view the roof condition and the inspector didn't have access to the roof in order to photograph it, the associate would be able to view the roof condition if recent aerial imagery is available and offered in this platform. So this vision left me wondering whether anyone else had done something similar. Lo and behold, role-tailored mapping is not an entirely new concept. There is evidence in the literature of similar ventures. In one case, Atzel and company identified media disruption as a major problem faced by the forest-based supply chain. They describe media disruption as the direct result of varying communication channels with no standardized way of sharing information. The overabundance of arrows you can see here in the lower part of this diagram shows the lack of centralized communication and indicates high levels of media disruption. In order to overcome part of this problem, Atzel and company, they created a role-tailored map dashboard with the goal of enhancing the information flow between links and the supply chain. They used an open source application stack to create the dashboard, which started as a centralized database using PostGIS, there on the left, then moving to the middle there with GeoServer, and then finally displayed using Leaflet. This resulted in a few web applications that were all presented together in a task-oriented start page. You can kind of visualize that in that last box. This meant that now forest workers could register new log piles, site managers could check these piles and see new ones, truck drivers could check deliveries and see where those piles were located, and then finally customers could see those truck updates and submit additional deliveries. So the results of this dashboard, it was found to reduce media disruption by 80%. You can see that in this figure where all of those arrows are converging into that centralized space that we would have liked to see prior. So that was how they were able to quantify the reduction of media disruption. They checked all the boxes. They said, this is all happening all in one place now. To wrap up this example of collaborative mapping in their own words, the idea is to put the users and their roles, as well as their daily working tasks in the foreground and to build the map dashboard around them. This paper is just one example of mainstream mapping starting to shift focus to enhance mobility and interconnectivity in a multitude of environments and applications. Another indicator of this recent shift was the Esri User Conference 2020 theme that just happened this past week. The title was GIS Interconnecting Our World, which explored how geospatial technology can integrate everything and engage everyone to overcome unprecedented global challenges. So how do we make this vision a reality? Atzel, they created a useful and potentially adaptable open source dashboard, but it doesn't appear to have been launched as a tool for others to develop and use. What if we could create a similar platform template with all this proposed collaborative functionality and then distribute it for anyone to use? That being said, the development of such a project is not without unique challenges. Designing and programming all this functionality from scratch on my own in less than a year didn't really seem feasible to me. So I ended up reviewing a plethora of literature and existing software that might support this development. And the most promising find was GeoNode. GeoNode is a geospatial content management system developed by the Open Source Geospatial Foundation. It is a platform for developing spatial database infrastructure, which is essentially the entire framework used to create, exchange, and consume geospatial data. GeoNode supports user profiles, which facilitate the use, management, and quality control of the data. Imagine it being the marriage of social media and data sharing, built using a host of open source web mapping tools, including GeoServer and PostGIS. It's mimicking that sort of structure that Atzel used in their open source application stack. GeoNode was originally developed by the founders primarily for disaster risk management, which is a field that necessitates the use of collaboration in order to accomplish goals quickly and efficiently. To clarify, it's not just the equivalent to Leaflet as an example of browser-facing GIS. GeoNode is an entire web application developed in Django, which packages up your choice of supported data stores, web services, into a conveniently structured user interface, which can be based on any supported mapping client. So, what can GeoNode do at the most basic level? You can add, host, and share map layers, both vector and raster format. You can edit layer metadata. You can style the layers and geometries of your layers. You can combine layers to create thematic web maps. Layer owners can assign permissions to other users and groups, adding a level of security that might be necessary to protect potentially sensitive data. That's something that I'm going to be working with Allegheny Inspections and their data. They also provide a support for a variety of OGC standards and mass market search standards, in which then allows for use with external desktop applications like QGIS. So developers can turn this demo dashboard into a dashboard of their own. The Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery developed the Innovation Lab that I have linked here to host open data for better understanding disaster risk across the globe. This GeoNode has over 150 data sets in 12 different categories of risk, you can see here. This is an example of one of the data sets that's in this store. And then this is a crude map that I was able to create that shows my stomping grounds here in northwestern Pennsylvania. So the point I wanted to make here was that GeoNode offers the basic framework, but it doesn't offer everything needed to achieve the collaborative vision that I've been proposing. So my project is going to develop in 4 main phases with these main goals in mind. The first phase was identifying and developing a framework, and I've already started this process since I've been learning about the GeoNode and working with it a little bit. The second phase will result in a prototype customized for use by Allegheny Inspections. The third phase will proceed once that prototype is finished and tested, which is the evaluation. And then the results of that evaluation will then become feedback that is integrated into the final product. That final phase will involve generalizing the prototype and sharing it with others in a public forum. The next few slides, I will discuss the main features of the prototype. This is an overview of the special abilities that each role will have in terms of collaborative functionality. I'm not going to have time to go into extreme detail with each of these, but I did want to bring attention to the fact that there will be some universal functionality where all these roles will have some ability to add case or inspector notes and any layers notes, and then also be able to attach documents to layers and to individual records. Some of this functionality is going to be brand new, something that that the company's not ever worked with before, but some of it's going to, that is already used in existing software. My goal is to merge everything into one platform instead of continuing to use those 2 or 3 different platforms, which is the current structure. That's, you know, it might look familiar to the media disruption that we saw earlier. So this is the first, you know, if we're going to discuss a bit about what this might look like in practice, this is the first initial page that someone would browse to where they would be able to log into their role, which would then give them access to a dashboard that has their default screen. This is something that I think we're all pretty familiar with. They have different screens and layers that they're able to select. They have a table where they're able to view the attributes of that layer. And again, this is all going to be customized for that particular role because there are going to be things that they're more interested as opposed to other roles in that way. This is where the more collaborative elements come in. This is the first documentation accessibility panel. So this is a place where users can add documents to a layer as a whole, which perhaps might look like any training materials that they will need to reference on a regular basis. The next panel is the case documentation panel. So this is the, you know, the single selected feature that's been, that it brings up this particular panel where a user can attach specific documents to that case. This might be where clients are attaching their orders, where inspectors are submitting their paperwork, where, you know, anything that needs all of the users to be able to view. And then at the same time, it could also have restrictions. So it might not necessarily be something that all members can view. That functionality is important to remember. The next element is communication. So now there's a panel where any users can post updates in the notes about the status of a case, or perhaps this is a place where the client lists special attention, special things that not every case usually would need, that this case might need. Any information that a quality associate might need an inspector to address. If they've already submitted the report, perhaps there was something missing that the inspector needed to address. This is the place where that would happen. Finally, this is the queue assignment panel. So this is specific to the field manager. This is a place where she would be able to click on a case. Then she would be able to bring up this panel where she can select which inspector to assign it to. Because the map is there, she's able to very clearly see who's the closest to that particular case, which makes it usually the closest inspector is the one who's requested to complete the case. So then she would be able to select that inspector and then submit that case to their queue. This is the queue. This is what they would be able to see and complete as an inspector. So they would, you know, be able to see all of the different cases in the map, and then they would also be able to view what needs to be done for that particular case. So that was just kind of the overall look. That's what the employees that I'm going to be asking to review this, that's what they're going to be able to see. So after they test, I'm going to ask each of the employees from each department to test this role and complete a questionnaire, which will include the rating of key design elements, the rating of the level of functionality and effectiveness that they were able to complete using their particular platform. And then finally, I would like them to rate the overall benefit and provide open-ended feedback. You know, was it generally helpful, kind of thing. This evaluation method will need to be approved by the Institutional Review Board prior to the evaluation period, so I am keeping that in mind moving forward. I'm going to need to know exactly what I'm going to be asking my coworkers about this. This is the overview of the framework evaluation, and this evaluation will be summarized into my final project report. I plan on rating the ease of development and the level of support for key features. I am anticipating that I will need to do quite a bit of programming in order to make sure that these elements are all wrapped up into my platform that I'm developing. And then finally, I'd like to talk to describe the invested resources that I had, you know, into this project. What was the amount of time that I spent? What's the expected ongoing maintenance for this particular platform? There are two expected outcomes of this project. The first is the generalized collaboration platform for distribution. I'm thinking about possibly sending this to, you know, putting my platform on GitHub. I also could submit an extension for GeoNode directly on their GitHub. And I could also share the virtual machine that I had to download as while I'm developing. I could submit a new virtual machine with modifications and publish it that way. There's a lot of flexibility there, and I'm glad, because I'm looking forward to working with my project and seeing what the best way to share it would be. The second outcome is a published assessment or suggestions for continuing GeoNode development as it relates to collaboration. This will be in the form of my final project report. And then I also plan to submit a summary report for the founders and developers to look at, kind of, you know, as a moving forward with continuing development of GeoNode. This is what we could make happen. And this would be additional functionality moving in a, you know, a better direction. The overall timeline of my project. So right now I'll be developing, I'll be starting phase 2 soon, which is the project development, and that will last until early October. And then after that's been developed and tested, I am expecting the evaluation to occur, which shouldn't take more than a week or two. And then once the evaluation is complete, I plan to present at the Northwestern PA GIS conference, which is still happening. Hopefully, it'll, you know, even if it does get moved, it'll get moved to a virtual platform. But either way, I'm looking forward to staying as local as possible. I expect that conference to facilitate some discussion and generate some additional feedback, which will then be used in the final distribution package. So this feedback integration stage that you can see at the bottom, that is going to be the period of time that I use all of the evaluations, the discussions from the conference, any other presentations that I'm doing. I would like all of that to become part of the feedback integration, which will then, you know, become a, you know, making sure that my package is the best that it could possibly be before I distribute it. So before I conclude my project or my presentation, I just wanted to recognize that I don't think the project is going to end after distribution. I plan on personally using the distribution package that I come up with to develop an online GIS access panel for the Venango County. I mentioned earlier that I recently started at as a geospatial analyst for the Venango County Regional Planning Commission. Currently, they don't have any online resource hub that grants access to basic mapping topics, which are relevant to citizens and employees alike. They don't even have the presentation level, the web mapping yet. I think that this is a great opportunity to, you know, be ahead of the curve, so to speak. If they are already managing any parcel subdivisions, environmental review, floodplain management, economic development projects, I think that it would be very forward of them to choose to develop in a more collaborative platform rather than just try to present that information. Some of the things that I think that would be useful for the county would include a public submission functionality. So the public would be able to access a role and then submit mapping requests or subdivision requests. They would also be able to assign a particular field assessment need to a field assessor, who would then be able to go out, wherever that is, and do what needs to happen. Maybe they need to do an inspection similar to Allegheny inspections. Finally, the field assessor would be able to enter that data directly into this platform and have GPS location tracking associated with that, just to make things easier for them. And then finally, municipalities that are participating in the county's GIS program would be able to have their own roles and special access to their own data sets. So I just want to, wrap this up by saying that it would be great if I could, upgrade, if I could already offer an upgrade to the county, instead of just presentation, instead of just public participation, why not also make it a collaborative process for them? And then finally, I want to express my utmost gratitude to Jan Oliver Wolgren for being so helpful during this process. He has been a wonderful capstone advisor, and I'm beyond thankful for his ongoing help and support with this project. And I also want to thank all of you for allowing me to share my vision with you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Great job, Alex. We'll see if we have some questions come in here, and when they do come in, if you can read them out loud for the recording. I'll start while I'm guessing some people are typing some questions. Mm-hmm. As you said, this is sort of a vision. It's a really interesting and practical project. Have any of your colleagues been given a sneak peek of what you're working on, especially given your future plans for the project?
I haven't. I was going to invite them to come and attend the presentation, but I decided just to kind of leave it more as a casual, like, hey, there's this thing that I'm doing, and I kind of want it to be a surprise because I don't want to influence them too much, since their evaluation is going to be part of the project. So I am very excited, and I think my coworkers are also excited because they're recognizing, like, the mapping resource that they have is not going to be there anymore. And I know that particularly my coworker, who's the field manager, she's always telling me, I really don't want to miss this resource because I use it all the time. So I'm looking forward to working with them and showing them, what I can do, because up to this point, mapping and GIS has they recognize it more as my passion rather than, something practical that I've been able to show them.
Nice. Well, I look forward to hearing how it goes.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sarah asked, can you see other applications for this? I'm not sure maybe specifically what you're asking for, but I can definitely see a needs across the board for this. I know that, particularly my county being one that might benefit from this platform, and then the other Allegheny inspections benefiting from it. I'd be I would be willing to bet that there are a lot of places that would want to be able to see this kind of functionality. Off the top of my head, it's kind of hard to imagine when you're, when you have your own perspective on things, but perhaps this is something that contractors could use in order to identify particular areas where, if they have multiple housing projects that are happening or multiple building projects, commercial projects that are happening, might be a way that they can manage all of the particular roles in their business process. I hope that's what you were looking for.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we will move on. Again, great job, Alex.
Thank you.
And if you can stop sharing, great. And then Gloria Ciccolini is next. So Gloria, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and start when you're ready.
Yes. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, share. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gloria Ciccolini. I work as a web support manager for a corporate accommodation company here in London, UK. And my capstone project is going to be about corporate accommodation opportunities using location intelligence and GIS, specifically property investments in San Antonio qualified opportunity zones. First of all, many thanks to my advisor, Daniel Steiner, for assisting me in this project. And there doesn't seem to be, can you see my screen? Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, the purpose of my study is to show how a UK corporate accommodations SME, which is a small or medium-sized enterprise, can use location intelligence and GIS in order to evaluate conditions for property investments in the San Antonio qualifying opportunity zones, also known as QOZ, and identify those local companies that might provide potential new clients. QOZ is an economically distressed community where investments can actually provide employment opportunities, favor economic growth, and result in tax benefits for the investor. A bit of a background regarding corporate accommodation and SME. So what does it mean, a corporate accommodation? You might have heard the different definitions, like service apartments or extended stay hotels, apart hotels, or corporate lodging or corporate housing. In any case, they all denote furnished apartments that can be used for short or long-term corporate lets. The corporate accommodation sector is part of the hospitality industry, and corporate accommodation small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, invest time, money, and resources in finding new property investments and in increasing the number of corporate clients. So location intelligence provides a competitive advantage, as we shall see. So the definition of a SME, according to the European Commission, which the UK still follows, a SME is a business company with fewer than 250 employees and an annual turnover less than or equal to 50 million euros, or an annual balance sheet which is less than or equal to 43 million euros. What type of clients book corporate accommodation or service apartments. There are two main groups, business and leisure. The business group, which are basically clients that travel for business purposes, work assignment, and relocation, include, amongst many, business people, engineers, scientists, university professors, PhD students, and writers. For leisure travels, we have of course tourists. However, my study will mainly focus on the first group, business group. And that's because in recent years, there's been a lot of competition from the likes of Airbnb or Uber real estate, and not to mention a well-known pandemic, which has affected all travel, but leisure travel in particular. What booking factors prompt people to book corporate accommodation? So mainly what corporates and agencies look for when choosing a service apartment. Corporates look for cost, price quality comparison, and location. Agencies, and when I say agencies, I mean any type of travel agency. It could be an online travel agency or a travel management company or a relocation management company. So agencies look for location, traveler safety, and length of stay. So location is a key factor. And bear in mind traveler safety, as it will explain why we'll use a certain type of data later on. As for my geographic scope, I chose San Antonio in Texas because of its variety of industries. Amongst many, we have the automotive manufacturing, the food and beverage manufacturing, aerospace and aviation, and biotech and life sciences. And this is just to name a few. Bear in mind that in recent years, cybersecurity is another sector which is quite present in San Antonio. There are more than 40 cybersecurity companies located in San Antonio. Not to mention the fact that San Antonio is also known as a military town because of the predominance of military bases. Moreover, according to the latest Texas Economic Development Guide, San Antonio is now a global hub of commerce and has a diverse set of industries that keep us resilient even in the toughest times. So industry diversification is a key factor as well. And these are the San Antonio qualifying opportunity zone highlighted in yellow, which are going to be part of my study. Actually, these are the zones I will focus my study on. The objectives are identifying companies within and outside San Antonio for potential corporate clients, evaluate potential real estate investments in optimal opportunity zones using location data, and examine local quasi-market segmentation using Esri Business Analyst Online. In terms of methodology, my analysis will begin by comparing the Texas sector workforce portion to the US workforce portion for the same sector, using analysis and data provided by the Texas Workforce Commission in 2010. Site selection and suitability analysis to identify property investment opportunities in the qualified opportunity zones and determine property stock. Accessibility analysis therefore analyze public transport, rail lines, rail stations, roadways, connectivity corridors, airports, and travel times, and analyze working population and the living environment of the selected areas, specifically crime incident data and socio-demographic metrics. Remember in slide 7, I mentioned that agencies look for traveler safety. So that's why I will also analyze crime incident data in each qualified opportunity zone. As for the data, I will use the 2010 US Census, the American Community Survey 5 years datasets, US and Texas Department of Transportation's shapefiles, the qualifying opportunity zone shapefiles and spreadsheets, the Texas Real Property Evaluation reports, Texas Office of the Governor reports, and the ESRI Business Analyst Online Tapestry segmentation. As for the software I will use in order to show my results in a map format, MGIS, ESRI Business Analyst Online, and RStudio. Challenges and limitations. Future travel and relocations due to the current pandemic situation. Leisure travel was mainly affected, but also business travel, of course. Inventory standards. There is currently no international agreement on how this service apartment should look like. And I know I'm stating the obvious, but according to UK European standards, a service apartment should have a kitchen or cooking facilities. But in other parts of the world, this is not as obvious as it may seem. And final supply chain management decision. That is, any supply chain management can decide whether to invest in such or not. Expected results determine those qualifying opportunity zones, which will most likely attract property investments from a UK SME, namely proximity to travel distance, and identify those that might provide potential new long-term clients based on the number of employees or revenue, import, export, and location. The timeline. After I finish my next class in November, December 2020, I will identify and refine the data sets in my possession, perform analysis, and record. Then by the time 596B starts, discuss my findings and create a paper that will be in January, early February 2021. And then in February, early March 2021, present my paper at a conference to be determined and incorporate feedback. By mid-March 2021, submit my project, my capstone project. So if you have any questions, you'll see here my email address in case you would like to contact me privately. And these are the references I use for my presentation. Thank you.
Great job, Gloria. It looks like you already have one question.
Right, let me check for it. Okay, great presentation, thanks. And use of GIS across many applications. Are the quals the same as the census opportunity zone? If so, where is the housing search to just this zone? The qualified opportunity zones are actually selected by the IRS. So that's where I found all the information. So they may not match the census opportunity zones unless they were added at one point. The qualified opportunity zones, bear in mind that the shape files I have are from 2010, so I don't think they match the census ones. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'll ask a quick question while if anybody else is typing their question. You mentioned some of the leisure booking companies like Airbnb and Uber. Do any of those compete for business travel bookings?
They're mainly focusing on leisure travel, but of course, after this pandemic, chances are they will also focus on business travel. All the more reason for ASMED to, start using location intelligence and GIS in order to, try to, focus on more property investment or find more investment opportunity and get as many clients as possible.
Thanks. Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, we'll move on, but it seems like a very valuable project, Gloria, and you're doing a great job, and look forward to seeing how everything goes and seeing where you present and how everything plays out. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Dave Ostrander is going to present next. So Dave, if you want to share your slides, and you can start when you're ready. And we don't hear you yet, Dave. I don't know if you're talking, but we don't hear you yet.
That probably helps.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Dave Ostrander. I'm the GIS director at a rural county in Illinois. And my topic is integrative approach to WebGIS for local building departments. And this presentation is going to focus on building permitting and building inspections. And so we'll talk about sort of the current practices of our local building department and then move into the solution and sort of the details of the implementation. So the state of Illinois provides a broad authority for local governments to oversee construction activities and set building codes and adopt building codes. And really that the express purpose there is to encourage the health, safety, and well-being of the inhabitants. So the current practice is what you would sort of expect from a rural county. People will trickle in and get a permit request, make a permit request to build something, and it's really just a paper-based system. So it's all very handwritten, form-based, and for the issuing of the permit and also the building inspections. And then communicating progress updates on construction projects is really a labor-intensive and sort of manual process, requiring in-person office visits, phone calls, and written email correspondences. And then when it's all said and done, there's a stack of paper that is then tucked away into a filing cabinet, and some of that information is manually transcribed, but really it is not accessible to anyone else. It's just very department focused and doesn't get shared across different departments that would want that information. So the new system, the proposed system, will offer a e-permitting solution where residents or builders can submit a permit approval online that can get reviewed by our building department staff. And then parts of these systems that are sort of the GIS components are integrating some of Esri's applications. And specifically, we're going to look at data collection applications such as Survey 123 in Collector, and then leveraging webhooks to automate back-end processes, and then look at using our data in smart ways to either by definition query-based services or view-based services. So, for example, if you take a single-family construction of a single-family home, there's a permit that gets issued, and then there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 inspections that need to take place over the course of that construction. And from setbacks to plumbing and electrical all the way to final occupancy. And so what we don't want to do is have a point for every single inspection, because that would really create a cluttered map and not very useful to sort of geo-visualize what's going on. And of course, properties can have multiple permits for multiple kinds of construction. So instead, our solution would employ a single point for a permit and then use a related record architecture for the inspections. And in the case of the county, there are 3 different flavors of inspection. And so we have 3 tables that are related to each building permit. So this slide says, why integrate? But really, the question is more, why wouldn't you integrate? So Esri's put together these commercially off-the-shelf applications that really are meant to be integrated with one another. And so from a use case perspective, the public would be submitting a request for a permit through Survey 123 form on the Survey 123 web app. That gets reviewed by building department staff, and then approved, it'd be plotted on a web app builder application. And then as that project progresses, they will use Workforce to schedule building inspections and assign them to inspectors. And then in a very real-time sort of way, inspectors will get those assignments on their smartphone or tablet, and then be able to use Integratively Navigator to get navigation or routing to those construction sites, and then tandemly use Collector to launch building inspection surveys through Survey 123. So the 2 data collection applications, and really this project is mostly concerned with building inspections because that is sort of the lion's share of the work. The Survey 123 app was released in 2016. It's a form-centric data collection application. It supports disconnected editing, which is important when you lose internet connection, or you have areas of the county that don't have internet connection. And it supports anonymous access. So again, allowing the public to leverage Survey 123 for permit requests. And then Collector is a map-centric data application that also supports disconnected editing. So when we think about form-centric and map-centric, we're really thinking form-centric is more attribute data-centric. So it's best suited for complex attribute collection. It's geo-capable, but that's not the focus here. And map-centric is geospatial data-centric and suited not for attribute collection. You can collect some attributes, but if you have a laundry list of things, it gets a little bit complicated for just about any user, really. So we're building our data, and we're publishing that out as a service. So we've got building permits, related records for our inspections, and related records for our building documentation, like the architectural plans and that sort of thing. And then we're using Survey 123 to connect directly to the back end, the related inspection tables, and create our surveys from that. And there's really an easy way and a hard way. So the easy way is to use Portal for ArcGIS or some sort of federated server. ArcGIS Online would also work. But the harder way is to do that with a non-federated server. So in our project, we're going to be using Portal. So once you have your data created, your feature services are published, and your survey forms have been created, the next step is to create a web map for collector and then set up a custom attribute display to launch those building inspection surveys. And so you can create a URL that actually does that for you using a URL scheme or a protocol for launching apps and invoking actions. So the first part of this link is to launch a Survey 123 app on a device, and then specifically open a survey. And then you can pass in fields such as the foreign key for the related record to maintain that one-to-many relationship, and also redundant fields that exist on every inspection survey. Now that we've created our data, published our services, created our forms, and produced our collector web map with the URL scheme, the next step is to leverage webhooks. And so webhooks will give us the ability to connect to a automation services platform such as Integromat or a Microsoft Power Automate, used to be called Microsoft Flow. And Survey 123 makes this really, really easy to connect up with those things, and it's a very powerful tool. So every time a new survey is submitted or an existing survey record is edited, it'll trigger a flow to execute on this automated service platform. And you can send things like the user info, so who was logged in and is conducting the survey, what time of day, the date time stamp, and also all the details that are recorded in each inspection survey. And what that does is really open you up to just a ton of options. Way too many to list here, but you can do things like write to a SQL database, create a CSV file on disk somewhere, work with Dropbox, SharePoint, just a huge amount of capability that is provided that happens programmatically on the back end. So this is a representation of one of the flows created for this implementation. And on the top, a HTTP request has come in from a survey that was submitted. And on a dynamic basis, it gets fed into some HTML code that was devised to create a polished report and then convert that into a PDF, which can be attached to an email and then sent to a customer, giving them their building inspection results. And again, the dynamic nature of this is you can dynamically update who the recipient is, the subject of the email, and there's a boilerplate email body, but also has dynamic aspects to that. And then if any of this should fail, we would receive an email saying that the inspection results weren't sent. So there can be missing information, or if the inspector makes a mistake and deletes the email or something like that, it will alert staff that the report and the inspection results were not sent. So these are the three flavors of inspection reports. These are modeled after our paper-based forms, and the one on the left is sort of a multi-purpose generic inspection form, but the one in the middle and on the right are examples of why you would want to use a Survey 123 form. There's a lot of sort of complex information that's being collected there. But this is the end product of what gets sent out. So one of the things you can do with definition queries when you publish your services is visually impart information to your users and sort of set it up for a to make them more powerful and not have to think about every little thing, and do that in a visual way, and basically adhere to the activities and roles that they're tasked to do. So one of the things that they have to keep their eye on is when permits are past their expected completion date. So all this data is really the same data, just being published repeatedly with definition queries. And so if a permit is published or is past its expiration or estimated completion date, then they will get a big giant red exclamation point on the map showing them that they need to pay attention to that. And then for building permits that have been closed, we keep them in the system in case they want to look at that later, but we're setting a scale dependency on that layer and also indicating through symbology what those different permitted work types were. So D is for deck, F is for fence, SF is single family home, etc. And then all active permits are green exclamation points, and our building inspectors that are sort of just being assigned work, they want to see everything. They don't really care if it's past the estimated completion date or not. So they see everything, and then the next one is just a reverse of that first one where it's active but not past the completion date. And then finally, we're bundling all of our building inspections into a single view. Because these inspections exist in 3 different tables, we're using SQL to pile that into a single view so that all of the inspection data sits in one related table, or at least appears to be in one related table. This comes in handy when they're doing reinspection fees. In case somebody fails an inspection, there's a fee associated, so they can just go in, count how many times it's been failed, and they don't have to hunt and peck for through 3 different tables to kind of calculate that up. So here's an illustration of that on the left. Those are the 3 tables, and the related building inspections are sitting within those 3 tables without the view. And with our service view, we see just one, it looks like one related table, and everything is stored in one place. Schematically, the architecture of this implementation there seems to be a lot going on, but really what's important is that all the data is stored in a SDE database and then published out as a feature service. And interacted differently depending upon if you're a field worker working from a smartphone or a tablet, or if you're in the office working with a desktop computer and using a browser-based way to get to those different applications. So I would like to just kind of show how this whole process plays out and give you a sense of how this could work for the office staff as well as the people in the field doing the inspections. So in the office, they get an approved permit. They're looking up an address in the web application, finding that address, excuse me, and then editing by dropping in a permit feature, plugging in what kind of permitted work this would be through a domain value list, assigning it a permit, and then filling in some common data attributes for the resident's name and address and that kind of thing. And then picking other dates and date fields and filling in domains. And then finally listing an email where the inspection results will get sent. And then they can attach things like architectural drawings so that in the field inspectors have that ability to see the plans without having to cart around paper documents. So once that's in, you can click on a building permit and see those attachments. And these are all scanned in at native source, so they can zoom in real tight if they're out in the field and see all the details that are in the plans. So the next part of this is the workforce part, where they schedule and assign building inspections, usually by looking up an address or a person's name from a permit. Create the assignment, pick what type of assignment type this is. So in this case, a setback inspection, assigning it to a inspector and picking a date and time for that inspection to be done. And then what's kind of cool is they can add some kind of comments like call the contractor, keys under the mat, that kind of thing that the inspector can pick up on in the field. And that's it. So from the office point of view, it's really just interacting with a couple of applications and quickly entering in some details. On the field side, we have their mobile device here, and they start their day out with using Workforce so they can see their to-do list for the day. And so here's the setbacks that we just scheduled. And see those comments to call the contractor right there. And starting the assignment is a simple click, and then they can choose to navigate to that construction site or simply open up a collector to launch the inspection survey. So that just very seamlessly opens up the collector, kind of centers them in on that point. By touching the permit, they see those URL schemed links, and that is just to pick whichever form they want to use for their inspection. In this case, the multi-purpose inspection form. That launches Survey 123. It fills in, pre-populates some of those fields that I talked about earlier. They pick the inspection type, and then conduct a survey, so pass, fail. And so if they put in a bunch of comments, say they fail miserably, it all gets put on a second page that gets sent to the client or the customer. So as that gets sent out, it's triggering our back end, our webhooks are getting triggered, and the inspector just goes back into Workforce, chooses to finish the assignment, gets removed off of his to-do list, and moves on to the next project. So the next thing that to look at is to make sure that that inspection form was emailed, and we just open up Outlook, see that that email comes in, and again, it's all dynamic, so we see setbacks inspection results. We have our boilerplate email body message with the dynamic updates, and then opening up the attached PDF gives us that inspection report, which again is all dynamically put together and can be configured in any way. I just decided to try to mimic their inspection forms as closely as I could, but that is what that looks like. And then on the feature service itself, we just make sure that that building inspection came through and see that setbacks are there and that they passed and that the information got recorded. So that's a single inspection to see sort of what it would look like with lots of inspections happening over the course of a period of time. You can zoom into this permit here, touch the related table, and see that all those inspections are there sorted by date. And then to do the reinspection fee calculation, it's as simple as how many pass, how many fail, and counting up those failures. So a lot of this work has been done. A lot of progress has been made. What's still outstanding is the identifying the permit process. So it's kind of understanding the permit approval process, which I intend to do next week, and then spend some time developing and prototyping that e-permitting environment and using Survey 123 to do that. And then the next phase, August 28th through the September 11th, would be sort of figuring out the utility and usability iterations to make sure that our users are happy with the product, and then putting that into a pilot program and field testing that before turning that into production. But my conference is on October 5th through 6th, or at least I hope. And so this will be the next kind of phase for that. And hopefully all go well, and then I can present in early October. And that is my presentation.
Great job, Dave. Does anybody have any questions? I'll start. Are there any model counties nearby that are doing some of this that you can look to? I know municipalities aren't great at sharing from my past experience, but are you aware of any like that?
So as far as I know, I'm kind of, at least in this general area, I'm kind of out in front on that regard. We're, assuming this gets adopted and widely used, we as a county could benefit if other municipalities started using it, because a lot of the information they're taking in needs to go into our assessment databases anyway. So using a webhooks sort of strategy would be able to write those records rather than having to sort of manually input them like we are now. But so far, I don't know of anybody doing exactly like this. There are some communities that, you know, have, they're purchasing like a third-party kind of software to do stuff like this, but I don't know that it's got the geospatial component.
Great. Yeah, I was also thinking about how having these in digital format from beginning to end will be great for the new normal with people working from home or going out into the field from home. So
Yeah. So Alex is asking, our projects are kind of similar, so I noticed that too. She says, offhand, do you happen to know how much about the cost premiums for ongoing use and maintenance of the software? So yeah, this is all going to be Esri based, and compared to what you're doing, Esri is not open and not cheap. We are fortunate as a county that we have a enterprise license agreement with them. So we pay a flat fee to get sort of like a all-you-can-eat buffet of software. So we pay about, what is it, $40,000 a year for this. But if you kind of look at, you know, what a third-party software would cost and only do like, say, one thing, we're really happy with the money we spend because this is just one facet of all of the things that we can do with GIS software, obviously. So it isn't cheap, but I think it pays dividends in the long run because we're not having to pay like all these different vendors to do implementations for us. Thanks, Alex.
okay, well, yeah, if there are no other questions, we'll move on to, sorry, there's lots of background noise in my house. Again, nice job, Dave and Andy. If you want to go ahead and start sharing, and you can start when you're ready.
All right. Hi, my name is Andrew Shobe, and I'll bring up screen share here. I will show my ugly face. I also had to calm down some folks in the background who were making similar noises in my household. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, I think. Let's see. All right, I'm going to stop my video just because sometimes I have bandwidth issues when the video is rolling. But all right, so if you can see the screen, hopefully you can. You'll see the project title here, which is kind of a mouthful: automatic change detection of human activity through algorithmic processing of remote imaging or remote sensing images. That's the topic for my project, and there's my information. I'll talk a little bit more about myself here in the overview, and then I'll work down through the same topics that others have before me. I got the pleasure of being not the last, but close to the last, so I'll save time for questions, hopefully, if you have them. Right. So about me, husband and father of two little ones who may occasionally make noise in the background. A while ago, I got a BS in aero engineering and astronautical engineering at the University of Illinois, and then I did some post-grad at University of Idaho, the other U of I, and put that on permanent hold, really, as I went into the Air Force and became a pilot. Through there, I got a Master of Arts in Military Science, which is pretty typical in Air Force circles, and then retired about 3 years ago, and now I'm a program manager at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab here in just outside of, or halfway between DC and Baltimore and Maryland, where I work on national security analysis. and in the department there. So the problem that for this project that I wanted to address was that humans continue to shape local and really global environments, but focusing on the local environments, and they do that through growth and migration. So I don't think anybody would be surprised. So this is how I'm defining the human activity here. But since improved over the last several decades, improved methods of transportation, cars and planes, and the proliferation of that, as well as in becoming a more mobile society globally, and globalization as well. It's the pace of that change of human development has really picked up, and keeping pace with that change is often difficult, particularly for local governments with small resources. Certainly in the two areas that I'll show you, those are challenges. and even more challenging then is seeing those trends develop and forecasting their impacts. That is more challenging, particularly again for those small governments, and so their ability to provide the basic resources that folks are paying taxes for becomes problematic and often lags the development itself. So hopefully, I believe that I can show that GIS is here to help. Not the only method, but one of a good set of methods that that data and tools are now available for to assist. So, as an example, I showed two pictures here. Above the top is somewhere nearby here in Howard County, Maryland, in 2013. That's kind of what it looked like from. This is from Google Earth Engine through the NAPE, the pretty decent resolution image there, and then same area in 2018, and you can see land being cleared, residential roads going in, and the dwellings, and then businesses and government structures usually follow as people settle in. Now, how do we get to that? Being able to quantify that activity. The enablers are really what make this more accessible now to potentially the local governments or those who are interested in studying it. The trends in remote sensing and data processing enable combined processing to the problem I just described. From a remote sensing perspective, both airborne and on orbit commercial sensing has expanded and improved in the last decade. Companies like DigiGlobe and others are across the world are putting up more commercial satellites and into orbit, and then more more airborne in forms of both manned and drones are able to take pictures and combine that with a resolution on those platforms that's increasing with technology, and we're getting fine resolutions of down to 8 centimeters in most cases. Meter or less is common in a lot of data sets over within the last decade, and certainly expanding rapidly over the course of the last 5 to 6 years now. Automation is also a lot talked about. AI, ML, computing capability; those have been improving, and there's a lot of published research that I've gone through regarding the application of advanced algorithms that analyze time series images to detect scene changes, for multiple or for differing means, whether that be for ecological or for tracking human progress, and also in the field of extracting features from those scenes to include man-made objects such as buildings and roads, and that's been dominant amount of the research I've looked at and this problem. And one example of that last is depicted there in a study where they did simultaneous road and building feature extraction in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, in the Middle East, and that that was using machine learning and a convolutional neural networks, in fact. So for this project, the intent is to look at a smaller subset of a particular area and develop a process where we might characterize a portion of that human change detection in terms of numbers of dwellings that or buildings being built. So to do that, we need to have a number of criteria that we'd like to meet in order to process those images. One of which being that they are multispectral isn't required, but much of the processing that can be done at the in the IR region as well as within the visual region of the spectrum gives you more options in the pre-processing of images to make those buildings and roofs really stand out, so that you can use techniques later to characterize and define those. The recency, I'm sorry, I put in there, I'm going to exclude LiDAR. I mean, the LiDAR provides excellent resolution, but for this project, it would have been difficult to do a lot of the pre-processing required. And I don't know that lots of high-res options will exist in the same location over periods of time so that we can do that change detection. So right now I'm excluding it for this study. Recent evidence relevancy for recency is also important. So I want to be relevant in the pictures that we look at. Also recent images will support the next bullet there on the sub-meter resolution. A lot of the research that I've read so far shows that if you're about a meter or less, certainly less would be great, but if you're about a meter, you can break out buildings that in features of areas of new construction. So that's our goal, is to find those. I'd like to be able to obviously find stuff that's within where I can get data at regular intervals over a good period of time. As well, the building rate in the United States for new housing is roughly 6 months, 6 to 7 months. So if you're able to see pictures annually or biannually, you're going to see pretty decent growth in particular areas. So the definitely going to need at least three more images to see change, and then if there are regular spaced intervals, that would be fantastic as well. I really like the data that I get to be public, because then it's free. We talked with the advisor, and he also suggested there might be options for those for-profit agencies like Digital Globe to possibly present data for those on a grant type basis for educational purposes, and maybe I could chase that one up as well. Anyway, the two cases of recent growth that I've taken a look at while researching this project is just through Google Earth Engine, and the two cases you'll see there one of the first one I mentioned already in Howard County, Maryland, just down the road from where I'm at now. And the other is Suffolk, Virginia, where I used to live, and I know that area pretty well. I know that there was been extensive growth. It used to be a field, and then you can see the image there in 2012, where where you're seeing quite a bit of housing, but then boom, I move to 2018 in both images, and you can see the real growth there. Both of those are at about 1 meter resolution. They're both from National Agricultural Imagery Program, and there's so hopefully there's enough. It looks like there's enough data there for this study, and as we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I hope that holds up. So the approach to get there, really applying combined methods, so two types of methods for both change detection and feature detection in order to answer the question. And so fortunately, there's already a body of evidence for both. And so we'll be using a process that combines both of those. Largely for each epoch, so each time step for each case, we'll spend the majority of the time pre-processing the images, finding and pre-processing. Once we got the data, we'll pre-process it, do building extraction and some validation, and then over those epochs, I execute the algorithm for change detection and measurement. Though types of tools, so as others have mentioned, the two challenges, and we'll talk about the risks in a bit, but the two challenges really are data. You have the data you need, and the types of tools, are they mature enough for the application? So I don't think there's enough time to go through a tremendous amount of development and training for like a convolutional neural network. But if there are already built algorithms that have leveraged that for building feature extraction, then intend to use those and appear to be, but that'll be part of the continuing discovery over the course of the next month or so. You see the icons for Python and MATLAB. I'm pretty comfortable in both, but not necessarily there will be a learning curve for me on either of those. And what would be great is to be able to tackle this in one or the other, but each have their strengths, and so maybe combining both of those in time. As far as environments to do that in, the challenge, if we're going to really work hard and train a lot of data, then we're going to need a lot of data to train, and that'll take time. And the computing power necessary to do that will be a challenge, probably outstripping what is sitting on my desk currently. And so we'll have to manage that as a go, potentially using like Amazon Web Services or something like that to and some of their machine learning tools if required. Hopefully we don't have to go all the way there. So for the expected results, hopefully these are evident based off of what I talked about. I want to quantify the growth of human activity in a particular region. We're going to focus small and focus on the process itself. By trying to answer any big questions with those particular regions. Create something that can be scaled. So we're all, as I develop the process and do the analysis, it'll always be cast in the light of applying that process in support of analysis of urban growth and for planning. But it won't be likely a product that's going to immediately come off the shelf and start answering big problems. That the risk is kind of in, if you haven't heard me say it already, in developing a process that's not scalable. So as I have an eye on that second bullet, I should be also addressing the risk that's involved as well. So as far as timeline, continue research on the processes and data gathering over the course of the next 2 months, and really drilling down on which of the tools and data sets that are going to be needed for this case, and if need to step up to something like AWS, then that'll be I'll identify that in those 2 timeframes there. So and then in the October to December timeframe, I have train. Hopefully that's not extensive. We'll pick the test case and run the data so less training and more testing those cases, and then refining the overall process, and then working on case 2 to make sure it's not just based off of a particular area, but that the process works across multiple areas, and then compile results. And all along, this is about addressing issues that are associated with growth. One of the interesting things I think might be one to at least hypothesize out of the results that come out of this is, how do you do it for shrinking cities where it may be less evident but just as important to determine a shift, for example in Detroit or something like that, where things are shifting and they're de-urbanizing. That would be my guess. My hypothesis would that have to include other data, but if the process overall supports it, we might be able to incorporate some ideas on how to expand the use case. All right, and then as others have noted, some folks have really been clever about how to tackle a COVID-19 situation with their presentation of the results. ERISA seemed to be a good venue, and they hold webinars, and it looks like a lot of our conferences are going at least virtual in particular cases. So I think that would be a venue that would be particularly interesting, or a local GIS conference that may come up as we go. So we'll be on the lookout for opportunities to present as these conferences and webinars continue to evolve their schedules based on the current situation. Overall, here's a list of references and stuff, and it'll be available, I think, if you can squint on the screen, you can see them. And with that, I'll go to questions.
Great job, Andy. Does anybody have any questions?
See if I can chat. Yeah.
And while people are thinking of questions, more of a comment than a question, but as far as presenting, we're going to keep, making sure that students have the opportunity to present so that they can graduate. We don't want anybody to have to push off graduation because of a conference not happening because of COVID, or, if a conference isn't able to go virtual. So you probably all saw that we had spring webinars for May graduates. We're doing the same for August graduates. I think next week is when we have some of those going, and I'm guessing the same will continue to happen as long as, if people are having trouble finding a venue.
And so Sarah asks, can you see other application for this process? Right now, I've, you know, I mentioned there toward the end, you know, how do you break out in maybe a de-urbanization situation, and if, let me go back to the process a little bit, just to, oops, wrong mouse. There, so, you know, if we change, like, for example, building extraction and go with like building, or with, I'm sorry, road extraction or something like that, I think, you know, we can build out this process and make a case for, you know, other applications that involve, you know, I'm trying to think of the government agency. We're looking at areas that maybe don't have the resources that they need, and so not necessarily the change detection process at the end, but you can look at areas that lack services and go based off of that and go, hey, let's work backwards and see where we went wrong so we can fix it. But I haven't really thought too heavily about application. I felt like it was pretty broad application. I'm trying to narrow it down a bit, but hopefully, and if anybody's got thoughts about, you know, what other applications might be out there, I'd love to hear them, because I find it pretty interesting. Brooks asks if I've looked at USGS for imagery. It won't likely be high res, but should be free. And yeah, I did briefly look through their data sets looking for something that was on the right order. And there have been studies, I haven't read them too closely, about how you do multi-spectral and multi-image fusion in order to take some of those data sets that have lower resolution and make them useful for processes like these. I think it's really interesting as well, but so far I haven't found anything in the USGS library that's meeting the bill. Resolution is really important for this, and I think lower res stuff may be a challenge to pre-process and make available. I'm going to keep digging though through all the sources and see what I can do.
Oh, sorry, I have a rooster in the background, so I have all kinds of distractions here. But again, great job, Andy. It sounds like you did not have any children making lots of noise in the background, or birds.
It could have been threats or bribery, one of the two.
Yeah. So yeah, great job, and I look forward to seeing how your project turns out. And on to the last presentation of the day. Thanks everybody for hanging in here. Brian Sweeney will present last. Brian, you can go ahead and share your screen and start when you're ready.
Oh, all right. Can you see that?
We don't see it yet. We can hear you.
Okay.
It might just be taking a minute. Oh, it looks like it's coming up.
Okay, good.
There we go.
All right, my name's Brian Sweeney, and my capstone project is on a spatial analysis of nationalism and political violence, focusing on a case study of the 2014 Ukraine Civil War. Now, I've limited it to 2014 because what followed 2014 was the emergence of a full-blown limited war between Russia and Ukraine. And so this is really focusing at the incipient stage of an insurgency that occurred in 2014, more civil conflict with the introduction of Russian influences behind the scene. And, and so that's kind of the difference why I want to segment directly on just that one limited period of time. So my background, University of Kentucky undergraduate in political science and geography. And to me, those two topics have always intrigued me and always been melded together in my mind. I'm a retired veteran, served 30 years. I'm currently working as a national security consultant to both public and private sector. And I've served in a lot of different conflict zones over the years. And one thing I've noticed, and it keeps popping back up as a pattern over and over again, is when a country starts to deteriorate, the government falls apart, the elements or portions of that country, groups, start to re-identify themselves and start to assert their identity and want to reestablish their security. And that's popped up in forms like ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, or sectarian violence in Iraq, or tribal conflict within Afghanistan. And the pattern just keeps emerging over and over again. And it's not always detectable at first sight. It's very nuanced, because sometimes an ethnic war can look like a religious war. But it's important to get down to the underlying conditions and to really understand what's the root cause of driving the controversy between those different groups. And I've always found it very useful to apply geography to those problem sets. And I've done that over the years and had extremely valuable insights that allowed me to kind of cut to the quick in assessing what's going on, what some of the key issues are, and what's maybe more peripheral. It seems like a big issue, but maybe overblown. So I find this very interesting to want to be able to apply this type of research geographically to this case study. So my goal and objective here, the overview is goal and objective is really look at how to apply spatial statistics to ethno-linguistic patterns of war in civil war in Ukraine in particular. I'll give a background on the Ukraine. I'll describe some of the literature that's discussed the 2014 conflict. Then I want to be able to go into a methodology of some of the different statistical methods I'd like to apply. Then I'll address some of the data, some of the different data sources, why some of it's better than others, and maybe while I'm going to have to make some decisions further on down the road over which one I go to. Then I'll go into expected results, the timeline, summary, and references. Goals and objectives. Really, the goal is to research and explore how spatial statistics can be used to identify nationalities and political identities. And in particular, I wanted to narrow this one down to ethnicity and language, because those seem to be key factors here. Even though there's economic issues, there's other issues, these two seem to be the most relevant key issues for this particular conflict. And so my research questions are, which ethno-linguistic factors are most important for forming these identities? And also not just looking at the national level, but looking at specifically down in Donbas, which is the conflict area in eastern Ukraine. And then I want to also address which spatial statistic methods are most appropriate for comparing and evaluating these different factors, and understanding what is most predictive of conflict in those types of areas and types of different conflicts. And I think that this really summarizes well what I want to do with this project, but I think it raises kind of the bigger question: how can it be applied to can it be applied to other types of conflicts? Can it also be applied to other post-Soviet Central European countries that are also seeing a legacy of Russian ethno-linguistic populations still embedded into their countries, not oftentimes treated well, but often being courted by Putin and Mother Russia as potential agents of influence in those areas. So I think that that's maybe a bigger application, a broader application of this work. So a very brief background on the Ukraine issue is that I really like a concept I'd read in one of the pieces of literature, was that the historic conditions have created two distinct ethno-linguistic nationalities within present-day Ukraine. So it's one country with two different nations. There's more nations, but there's two really relevant political contending nations. One of them is the Ukrainians. They're depicted on the map as the west and center in yellow. And the other one is the Russian areas, which are the darker blue or dark green, and then the mixed areas, which are a lot of times ethnic Ukrainian speaking, but Russian speaking populations. So a mix there. And those historical boundaries of between those populations are really go way back, almost a millennia, but most recently to the that red line on the map that shows the Kingdom of Poland represents a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it really preserved intact the ethnic Ukrainian culture for a long time. And it was the Russian Empire, you can see over on the right side of the map, also expresses an interest in expanding its empire, and did so in eastern part of Ukraine, in the eastern wilderness steppes, which were pretty much large unoccupied estate areas. And Russia encouraged, the Russian Tsar encouraged the Cossacks from the Don River Valley to go ahead and move on up there and occupy that space, and it would be theirs. And that's exactly what they did about 200 years ago, 250 years ago. And they described it, or they labeled that territory as Novorossiya, which means New Russia. So that sentiment that has belonged to Russian peoples, maybe not always recognized as part of Russia, but still ethnically and linguistically significantly dominated or influenced by Russia, is really kind of defined the geography for hundreds of years since then. It's been further reinforced by post-World War II Soviet industry, which planted itself down in Donbas. And Donbas stands for the Donetsk Basin region. And so that industry planted itself down in Donbas, and Russia, or the Soviet Union, migrated workers from all parts of Russia to inhabit the area, to work in the factories. And even a lot of Ukrainians came over from the western part of Ukraine to work in those factories as well. And so it became a very densely populated area of Russian speakers, but mixed in terms of ethnic Ukrainians living in the countryside and around the factories, and in the densely populated areas being ethnic Russians. So fast forwarding to the post-Soviet era of 1991 and beyond, the Ukrainians no longer having the Soviet Union over them and now getting their autonomy, sought to redefine themselves as a modern Western country and understand what it was to be Ukraine. They're grappling again, as many failed states do, with their sense of identity. So they turned away from Russia because of the dominance that has been there for so long. They favored ties with Europe because of the economic opportunities that lay there, except Novorossiya, or the Donbas area, which still had a lot of business and economic ties with Russia, and certainly political and cultural language relationships. All their TV and radio comes from Russia, all the actors, so they share that culture based on language, even more so than ethnicity anymore. And therein lies the conflict, is that Ukrainians are Western oriented, looking for a different way, and the Russians in the Donbas region are still looking towards Russia for leadership. And the two, going in opposite directions, find themselves voting for presidential candidates that represent the entire country, that oftentimes split the direction or the orientation from one from the other in that country. There's also a couple of nuances that I really want to tease out, and I found this in an earlier project I did working on data analysis in a previous course, which is many of the Eastern ethnic Ukrainians also speak Russian as their primary language now because they've been there for a couple generations, but their allegiances remain unclear. And that's kind of what I really want to get at during this study, is understanding, where is this an ethnic war between Ukrainians and Russians in that Donbas area? Or is this really more of an allegiance of culture and language between ethnic Ukrainians and Russians working together to kind of oust Ukrainian government influences. So that's not readily apparent all the time. And I want to be able to see if that's apparent in geographic statistical analysis. In the literature review, once again, a historic imprint. You can see it at the top of the map. On the left, the top map has the ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine, the yellow being Ukrainians and Ukrainian speakers, and the blue and light blue being Russians and Russian speakers, and the light blue actually being the Ukrainian ethnic Russian speakers. And so you see there's a distinct pattern. And then if you look below that, you also see there's a distinct political pattern. So that ethno-linguistic characteristics have imprinted itself and shown up in its political elections as well. And the Russians tended to favor more of a kind of a centrist position, keeping kind of economic ties with Russia, maintaining Russia and Ukraine as kind of two languages, but not really concerned about the Ukrainian language much, but really focusing on a pro-Russian party of regions, represented in blue by Viktor Yanukovych. And this is the 2004 presidential election map, which looks exactly like the 2010 presidential election map. The other candidate representing the Ukrainian side of things was Yushchenko, and he's our Ukraine's People's Self-Defense Bloc. And there's like 50 different political parties, but really this bloc really kind of represents Ukrainian nationalism emerging. And Yushchenko won the 2004 presidential election, only to be poisoned in 2008 and nearly died, but then lost the election in 2010. And a lot of the suspicion, and it's pretty obvious, that Russia was likely involved in poisoning the president. And then the presidential election won by the pro-Russian president in 2010 was oftentimes thought of as a fixed election, that there was a lot of heavy meddling by Russia in terms of the electoral process and the vote counts and such. So it was always a contested election come out of 2010. So around 2014, most of the Ukrainian nationalists had become upset and fed up with what they thought was a pro-Russian president working on behalf of pro-Russian cronies and to the benefit of Eastern Ukraine, to the detriment of and suppression of ethnic Ukrainians. And that resulted in the Euromaidan revolt of 2014. That revolt was the tipping point. It wasn't the start. It was the tipping point of centuries of background repression that needed to be redressed. And it's culminating now in terms of how do they reform the identity and maybe even at some point the boundary lines of Ukraine. So the methodology I'm taking on this is it's kind of a two-step approach. Is one, I want to look at it from a regional context, primarily the country of Ukraine itself at the oblast level, which are the provinces, and understand nationality, ethnicity, and the patterns of conflict and how they correlate with those patterns. And so one's going to be a regional context. And the regression model I'm using is just below that on the below the map images there, where it's a classic regression model where variable y is the conflict events, and then the which would be predicted by the coefficients of independent variables, one of them being ethnicity, and other independent variable being language, and then a random term variable as well, or random error term for residuals. And so applying that at the regional level to see what it looks like from that perspective, and then focusing in on the Donbas or eastern Ukraine area, because most of the events occurred there, and getting in more detail. And you can even look on that little thumbnail map there, Eastern Ukraine, all those little red dots there represent conflict events and they are really, really focused on the densely ethnic and Russian and linguistic area, as opposed to the mixed areas, not as much, but there's some on the boundaries there. So the analytical method is to, first I want to be able to test and evaluate randomness of the data, whether it's random or clustered, and you apply hotspot analysis as well as cluster outlier analysis, just to make sure I've got a well-framed data set. And then I want to test the random clustering of the residuals. Look for bias and variance by applying global regression analysis in ordinary least squares and spatial autocorrelation to better understand if that clustering and those residuals are useful. Lastly, to get right down to determine the statistical significance of the coefficients by looking at local regression analysis methods, because some of those regions, looking at statistical analysis in one area that's heavily, densely Russian ethnicity and language is going to be different than looking at one that's more of a mixed ethnicity. So that globally weighted regression and inverse distance weighting regression analysis will be very important to make sure that I catch the local significance of the local conditions relative to the types of conflicts. Data sources. So there's a lot of different conflict data sets out there. One of them is Armed Conflict Location Event Database, ACLID, which is really useful, but unfortunately they didn't have any data for this time span. University of Maryland START Global Terrorism Database has a lot of good data, has 1,380 data points for this problem set for this period, which is really useful, but I'm not sure if they capture a lot of the nuances of things that maybe are not considered terrorism related. And so I'm looking at a secondary data set. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program has some excellent data sets, particularly related to Eastern European conflict in the Balkans. And there's another one of the PRIO data set. So those are my primary data sets. The types of things that are in the data set are, of course, the date and location. The type of attack, whether it's an arson, a small arms attack, or a bombing is important. The type of target is important. Do they attack a building, a facility, infrastructure? And then actor 1 and actor 2. This allows me to get past just having background demographic data and try to understand conflict patterns. This actually tells me who the belligerents are in this action. If it's 2 civilian groups. And this data also gives source reference. So I can actually go back and look at, okay, here's the link to this event. Oh, this was an ethnic Russian attack against an ethnic Ukrainian civil group. So there's more depth that I may have to find a way to enrich the existing data if it's not already embedded in there. The human geographic data sets are my independent variables. And the Ukraine National Census of 2001 is extremely thorough. Even though it happens 13 years prior to the 2014 event, the constituencies of the different ethnic and language groups have not changed drastically in the intervening years. It certainly hasn't grown much. It may have depressed a little as some people left the area looking for jobs elsewhere, because the Donbass did become a bit of an economically depressed region because it's no longer creating munitions for this former Soviet Union. The problems with that is that under Soviet rule and the same feelings and attitudes about the census, where you tell the census taker what you think they want to know, not necessarily what's actually the truth. So there is some bias that's in that census. So there's some other different types of surveys, Ukrainian national surveys that came out in 2012, 2014, and a lot of that is described in my literature review that look at what the opinions are. I speak primarily Russian at work, but I speak primarily Ukrainian at home. Well, that can't show up in the 2001 census because you'll get one choice or the other, a primary language, no secondary language. But it does show up in these surveys. And that helps to kind of get at more of the nuances of the the population that we're trying to study here. The last thing is the Ukrainian administrative boundaries. There's a lot of great boundary data sets. There's the global administrative data sets that are GATM that's out there that tends to be the go-to for everybody looking at foreign countries. But when you put that side by side and look at other maps, you start to see there's a lot of inconsistencies. There's parts that are missing. It's not as well refined. The subsets of data underneath it are not as well defined either. So I went to the Cartographia, which used to be the official cartographers of Ukraine, and it's now a private company that's sponsored by the government of Ukraine, and they had an excellent set of boundary files that I could use at the national, the oblast province level, and the rayon district level. And they also come with some interesting attribute data associated with that too. So I found that extremely, extremely valuable. So this is from a project I did last semester, and some initial observations were that if you look at the left map, that is the ethnicity, the blue being Ukrainians and the green being Russian ethnicity. And then if you look at the right map, it's language. And you see that there's more Russian language speakers when you compare it to the ethnic Ukrainian area. So that describes right there that there is a significant amount of Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainian areas. So the question I have here is that all those dots that represent conflict data, what are they representing? Because at this point I haven't, last semester I didn't dig into what those points represented other than conflict events. So those conflict events could represent everybody who speaks Russian against, railing against the Ukrainian government's buildings and police stations and municipal buildings. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, or hypothesis, is that it could be, oh, those are ethnic Russians fighting directly against ethnic Ukrainians to drive each other out, to kind of ethnically cleanse each other, even though they may or may not speak the same language. So that's what I really want to get at in this study, is one level deeper of this analysis to figure out what is really going on there, to understand that nuance of, is it ethnicity or language? Or is it really neither? I don't think we're going to know. I don't think I'm going to know until I get into it. So here's the expected results, is that those conflict events in Donbass will be more highly correlated with Russian language factors than ethnicity. That's my gut feeling. That's what I expect. And it suggests that language propagation is a powerful influence on politically salient identities, strong enough to conduct acts of political violence. I think reading between the lines, you could also say that the Russian language and Russian culture and Russian media can be a vehicle for Russian influence from externally to those populations to make them more politically salient, and also influence them to go into a mode of violence. So I think that that's what my expected results are to find that. I'm really looking forward to digging into this. So some of the considerations I have to have with this is that characterizing the population. Do I go with the census data or the survey data, or kind of back and forth? Well, that's yet to be determined. The modifiable aerial unit problem. Do the locations of conflict events coincide with administrative boundaries? I mean, are they in the center of the boundaries, or do they run right along the edge of the boundaries? Because that's going to make it more difficult to do regression analysis if they're along the boundaries. But I think that most of the political acts of violence occurred at government facilities in the town centers and town squares. So there might be two different types of patterns I end up finding. Is one in town centers, in the middle of those administrative areas, or where the conflict events will be concentrated against the government. Things along the boundary might be different. It might tell me maybe it's a conflict between boundaries of different ethnic groups. Still to be determined. Interesting, but it is an issue that I have to consider as I explore this. The other issue is ecological fallacy. Can these conflict events be accurately attributed to an ethnic group in mixed areas? I mean, if and And in the survey data and in the census data, that is absolutely the problem if they were just generic events, because I can't really associate a generic event happening in an area with one or the other ethnic group. I think the data sources, going back to the conflict data, where it says actor 1 and actor 2, and even provides a source citation for where that report came from, will allow me to get at, was it an ethnic or civil versus government kind of issue. So that's where I'm going to deal with the ecological fallacy contention. Project timeline, already gone through the developing, refining the concept and the literature review. I've already collected most of the data sources, but they still need more work. And then I've not yet to identify a conference. I've thought about, well, I've yet to identify one. But in the August time period, I'm going to test and compare methods. I take out a different class next semester for my next course in the GIS Master's Program, and then I'm looking at refining the methods and refining the analysis in November, and then completing a capstone report by March. And I would like to be able to present at a conference before May, but maybe it may be in the summer, probably a spring conference to be determined. In summary, I think the historic conditions have created two distinct ethno-linguistic areas in present-day Ukraine. Ukrainians want to redefine what Ukraine is, and likely also who Ukraine is, as Russians want to define what their future is and their portion of Ukraine. I think there is the big question for me in this project is Eastern ethnic Ukrainians who also speak Russian as their primary language, where is their allegiance? Are they victims or are they participants? And then how spatial statistic methods can help me understand or help understand the presence of political violence and how it's related to ethnic or linguistic factors. So I've got questions. After that, I've got references stacked in there for both the literature review and the data sources. But at this point, I'd like to address people's questions.
Great job, Brian. Does anybody have any questions? And you have a couple questions there from Andy and Alex. And you're muted, Brian. I don't know if you're talking.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, from Andy. Love the topic. Perhaps it's in the charts and I missed it, but is there enough difference between percentages of ethnic language and ethnicity in some areas of the conflict region to differentiate? Yeah, there's certainly, there's some area, those areas with the ethnic Russian speakers, with the Russian language speakers who are ethnically Ukrainian, there's about a 30 to 40% difference between those who say they're ethnic Ukrainian and what should be kind of the delta between them and ethnic Russians. So there's a 40% difference in there. Now, like I said, the survey information might show that people profess to be ethnic or Russian language speakers because that's their work status. But they may be Ukrainian language speakers primarily in the home place. So I think the survey is important there because I think what you're asking is really kind of discussing bias a little bit, and are those ethnic Ukrainians really biased to the question and want to make sure that everybody knows that they speak Russian? Next question.
Yeah, you could skip over Alex's question and go down to
Okay. Okay, and it seems that there's from Brian King, it seems that there is an assumption that the location of the conflict event is tied to ethno-linguistic patterns. But are there also other scenarios? I mean, did this occur at particular historic locations or markets, etc., that were more different, determinative in why the conflict event occurred where? Yes, I haven't yet determined if there's any more historic, like representative kind of places, like around statues or monuments to great leaders, kind of what we see a little bit in the streets today in terms of here in the United States, tearing down monuments and such. But it's certainly been the majority of conflict events have been against government administration buildings, courthouses, police barracks, or police stations, military barracks, and things that represent the government of Ukraine. So that's what's really focused my interest there. I did look at economic factors. In fact, there's quite a bit of literature on economic factors, and they tended to debunk that, but I do think it's an overall theme in that the economic orientation of that community is towards Russia, but the local economic factors don't seem to have any statistical relevance in terms of why one place was conflicted over another. There is a religious undertone in terms of maybe where places are Eastern Orthodox Kievan or Eastern Orthodox Moscow oriented subsects of Orthodox religion. So there is some stuff there, but that seems to follow almost right along with ethnic and linguistic lines. So it's a little bit of a wash there. I hope that answered your question, Brian. Daniel, your topic includes nationalism and political violence. If your scope seems too open, could you use ACLID to start? I think it's ACLID to select types of violence, riots, attacks, of spatial data analysis, or scale them, categorize, and detect predictable patterns. That was my first go-to, is ACLID data. Unfortunately, ACLID data only starts in the Ukraine in 2018. Very disappointing. It shows the current conflict, but it didn't track the earlier elements of the conflict. So I'm kind of limited to the University of Maryland START's global terrorism database data and the Uppsala data, which I hope it has more interesting, or I hope has more attributes with regards to ethnic groups. Okay. Any further questions? I really appreciate those questions. They're really good.
One more from Brooks.
Okay, one more. Why interest in this conflict on our part of the world? Where there are others, where there are other conflicts you've considered for study? I've done actually a lot of research in everything from Southwest Africa and the Balkans. I spent a lot of time working in the Balkans and studying the Balkans, the Middle East as well. I think that the Ukraine issue is interesting because of the emergence of Russia being more aggressive towards its neighbors. And it's part because of their interest in maintaining their zone of influence, but I know it's also a reaction to what they see as NATO encroachment. But there are significant populations inside of, like, Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, for instance, who are ethnic Russian and are not considered citizens of those countries, so they are disenfranchised from the political process. Russia has since, and that's a real tragedy, because they're actually creating the roots of their own conflict by differentiating their internal pride. And they've also armed because they're afraid of Russia, they've also started to arm local militias that are not ethnic Russians. And so Russia has started a policy of issuing citizenships and passports to those populations that live for 4 or 5 or 6 generations in those Baltic countries. So that's a political issue that's going to boil up, because those ethnic Russian populations are not being politically represented, and Russia has can justify, maybe not legally, but certainly morally, the intent to protect them. And maybe that starts in the same way it started in Donbass, through little green men helping to create and train and advise subversive groups that seek separatism. And I think that's that kind of gray zone of warfare that's short of tanks rolling across the border that is more probable to happen along Eastern European countries than the latter. Okay.
Yeah, great job again, Brian. Clearly, you know a lot about the topic, as everybody is acknowledging here. Very interesting, and look forward to hearing how it finishes.
Okay, thank you. Sarah mentioned something about GDELT data.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, in fact, I spun up a GDELT instance in Google Cloud Platform and created I've created some catches from GDELT as well. Unfortunately, the events aren't very accurate in terms of locations in GDELT. I wasn't seeing that. And I was also seeing that there's a lot of redundancies in GDELT that are kind of hard to tease out with this particular data. But that's a great idea. I'll look at that again as well. All right. I think that's the end of the questions. That concludes my presentation. I appreciate everybody's patience lasting out to the end of the day with me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Everybody did a really nice job. This was the final day of the presentation, so no more for the summer term. But reminder, I put that link there again for those evaluations for your peers, so please do fill those out. We hope to get all of those in within the next few days so that everybody can access that and then sort of move on to the project phase. So thanks again to everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Let me know if you ever have any questions.